want to spend some time just understanding the poet themselves, and specifically Kaki. What are some of the themes you're working with right now, and have some of those themes changed with I think the pandemic news, which takes up 80% of every website.
Yeah, well, so have been kind of in a weird place because I've been finishing up this book that really has been done for, it's been done for almost a year, but then I found with, this is my third book, and so I found that what happens is you think you're done, and then you spend all of this time tweaking little things. And so that's the phase that I've been at. Like the final edits haven't been sent to the publisher yet. It's in that middle phase between, the book is basically done, but I'm doing a little bit of editing and a tiny bit of revising. But anyway, so it feels very strange because this book it very much feels like a product of another time. It's a book of the before times. So I'm wondering, feeling a little strange about how that's gonna, the pandemic has changed the way we think about everything, the way that we see the world. And so it is strange to think this thing that hasn't even been released yet, this book that hasn't even been released yet is already dated in a way. But the things that I was thinking about when I was working at this book is called The Survival Expo. It ended up including a whole lot of poems about Tennessee. I had moved back to Tennessee right when I was finishing up my second book, and so not as much Tennessee stuff had made its way into the second book. And this third book, I didn't intend to write a bunch of poems about Tennessee, but I think I had just been thinking about living here a lot again. And the 2016 election is a backdrop for a lot of the poems, kind of thinking about Southern states, thinking about privilege and voting and all of that kind of stuff. So there's some threads related to kind of what were the pressing current event things happening in 2016, 2017, 2018. So in terms of how the pandemic is affecting my writing now, I've only written a couple of poems during the pandemic, and I think it remains to be seen kind of what I do next. I'm very excited about starting a new project, and that new project is what I really want to get into this summer. But I've got to get my edits off to my editor first for this book. But I think there may be a little bit of revising that I do that affects a couple of poems. Maybe I'll add one pandemic poem to this manuscript. But yeah, so I didn't really answer your question except to say that it's interesting because I think in all books that are being published right now, there really feels like a split between anything that was written before the coronavirus became a fact of our lives, and everything that's written after. It's gonna really it's gonna really create a line between those two points in time.
Yeah, and I think I'm amazed that you've been able to kind of keep this book in one part of your life and leave the current events right now on the side.
Yeah.
Because part of it is it would be very easy for the kind of pandemic voice to just go back through every poem and change some of the intention. So I'm applauding you for able to keep that focus.
Yeah. Well, and it's not a complete break, I don't think. Some of the same things I was thinking about in the first book are still, in the previous book, are still things that are part of the conversations regarding the pandemic. And there also is a kind of a weird amount of stuff in this book about like my neighbors. I've lived several different places in Memphis, and I have a fascination with my various neighbors, and so I've been thinking about my neighbors even more than before because we're all at home. And so I feel like there are some kind of significant threads and also some superficial threads that maybe would carry over. But yeah, it does feel like I'm ready to kind of move on and start something new that is existing in this time, this time that we're in right now.
then just let me ask you one more question. Then we want to hear your poetry. Has maybe the pandemic, current events, or closing one book and opening another, is it starting to change the way you write, or how? I'm just wondering if you see an effect for yourself, kind of now and going forward in terms of, hey, there might be longer poems, shorter poems. It might be, I'm just trying to understand if there's been an effect for you.
Yeah. I'm not sure that I've written enough during the pandemic to know exactly. I know that I feel a real resistance to writing directly about what's happening, like that there's something that and this tends to be my reaction to anything that's kind of current event like, is I don't usually tackle it head on. I kind of find a roundabout way to address it. So I don't know that like how it's going to affect what comes next subject matter wise. That is an interesting question about attention, a kind of attention span, because that's one of the things I've felt like for the past 2 months, my attention span has been really weak, that I haven't been able to pay, attention to reading for as long as I used to, or to doing just about anything. So it may be, maybe I'll be writing a bunch of very short poems. That will be the thing that I do. But I think, I think I was reading a thing, an article in the New York Times last night by one of their main book review editors, and she was talking about time and how the pandemic has affected the way that we all think about time. I read
part of that today.
Yeah, it's really wonderful. I thought that was really wonderful, and I thought she really hit on something that I think is interesting to me, and is something that I want to think about in poems. Like how do you account for the kind of interesting, compressed and distorted experience of time that I think a lot of us are feeling right now. Like on the one hand, all of the days are running together, but on the other hand, it's very, very slow. And so that was something kind of poetically I thought, I might try to play around with that a little bit, or think about that a little bit.
Yeah, every day is a Saturday now.
And I mean, everyone is having that feeling of like,
Saturday.
That's right. And just kind of mixing the days up, where you're like, well, what day was it that happened? Yeah. Or even, with my students, thinking about, before the semester ended, we would be referring to things, that we had talked about in January. And then January feels like 3 years ago or something. Like January is like, it's so far away. I was trying to get them to remember, things that we'd read or discussions we'd had. And it's like, oh, I don't know, that was January, So yeah. Time is a very strange thing right now.
Yeah. Well, good. Thank you for sharing all those insights. And we look forward to hearing some of your poems now.
Yeah, great. So these are all going to be poems from, and I've done a couple of these readings and I can never figure out if I should print the poems out or put them on my screen. So I'm putting them on my screen, which means I can't see you. But so just holler at me if there's anything weird happening on the screen. But so these are all poems from this manuscript. The Survival Expo is the title of it. And I'm just going to read a handful of them, starting with the first, what is right now the first poem in the manuscript. And I don't think this poem really needs very much of an introduction, but I played basketball growing up. And so, it shaped my life in lots of really kind of fundamental ways. But being a female athlete, but also just being part of a team. So one of the things that happens in this book is there are a lot of poems that play around with the first person plural, this we voice. So that's kind of what's happening here too. This is called Jocks. The back row in American history, already wearing away uniforms under our warm-ups, popping purple gum. Some of us in lipstick stolen from our mothers, others mistaken for our younger brothers, with buzz cuts, cornrows, jacked up ponytails. We didn't care about the presidents. We cut out early in a seamless blitz of nylon sheen. Our thighs were staggering, our stretches legendary. counting 4, 5, 6. We swore we saw the bleachers flinch. We licked our palms and rubbed our sneakers clean and couldn't stand the Pentecostal teams with their set shots and culottes. What was worse than modesty? And who could top our coach, destroying clipboards, screaming, "Get your man," whose fury was the only compliment we'd ever trusted. Most of us believed that suffrage meant collective suffering. We weren't discerning, but we weren't unsure. Our trick plays worked. We wore each other's sweat. Our pregnant captain didn't know it yet. I forgot to say there's just kind of a joke in the middle of this poem where we would do this thing when we were stretching, when we were counting our stretches, and we would, instead of saying 6, we would say sex, and then we would watch to see if anybody caught that, and if it made them uncomfortable. I don't think it really made anyone uncomfortable, but we like to think that. So this is actually, I think this is the second poem in the book. And this poem is part of a series of prose poems. And you'll hear when I'm reading it, it sounds a little talkier. And they all feature this character named Hope, and who is a composite character based on a couple of my cousins who would probably murder me if I used their real names. So I sort of blended them together. So this is, so anyway, there are several poems that have this character, Hope. I'm going to read a couple of them. This is the first one. It's called A Supermarket in Tennessee. The title is alluding to Allen Ginsberg's famous poem, A Supermarket in California. A Supermarket in Tennessee. The morning after my cousin Hope won $200 for beating the crap out of a woman on stage at Blanchard's, I went to Kroger. I used to worship her, older, taller, tougher, my very own ego's fog machine. But there I was, freezing my ass off while I looked for what she needed. It was a week of new laws, headlines reading, "Wine in groceries, guns on campus." Both sides still buzzing, righteous, both sides a little bit appeased. Hope called to say her eye was swollen shut, and who was I to judge? Hadn't I huffed my share of duster? Hadn't I made a boyfriend sexy magnets of me in hot pink underwear and different outfits he could change? He'd stuck them to his locker. His friends were super jealous, and there's no telling who else saw. But even then, I knew I'd never run for office. Hope took the pictures for me. This was before I went to college, before Hope got caught stealing blueberries, before the Kroger was a Kroger. My mother said that was the moment things went south for Hope, as if someone suddenly starts stealing blueberries. I wanted to say I haven't been unkind. There is so much that mortifies us later. I don't think about what happened to the magnets. I don't think about the students I should arm myself against. Who knows what's worth $200 once you're 6 drinks in at Blanchard's? They call it foxy boxing. Hope's face was puffed up worse than I expected, but of course I lied and said it wasn't bad. I brought her what she wanted, a box of white and ice. As kids, our favorite game was Diner. I cut and glued the menu's paper food, and we'd spend hours taking orders. So that's in the way that the book kind of flows, that's your first introduction to the character of Hope and the relationship between the speaker of these poems and Hope. I'm going to come back to her in just a minute, but I'm going to read one more. I mentioned this, I wasn't going to read this poem, but I mentioned when we were talking that I had these poems about my neighbors in this book, and I think probably I'm going to have a lot more poems about my neighbors after this pandemic, because I'm seeing so much of them, learning so much about them that I did not know. So this is a poem, a kind of post-2016 election poem. about, and I don't think this is as much of an issue in where you guys are, where most of you guys are in Massachusetts, but there's a thing that happens around here where you're kind of constantly trying to figure out where people stand politically. Anyway, so that taps into this, but also just the mysteries of your neighbors. So this is called I Think About My Neighbors. I think about my neighbors more than I'm sure of this, they think of me. In part because I don't know how they voted. In part because I hear them backing up their burrito truck at all hours of the night. A big truck up a steep and narrow driveway, which never works until the man gets out. The woman always drives to shout directions, and she shouts, "What?" Because the truck is beeping and has been since she put it in reverse. And I only called it a burrito truck since one side's painted with a pinup girl who's straddling a burrito. They might sell a bunch of different foods. We've never met, so I don't wave at them outside their house, their yard, like mine, in need of some attention, their porch a little like a pirate ship. But sometimes he'll be hosing off the truck, or she'll be bringing groceries in, or hanging a wind chime fashioned from the small, sharp bones of an animal they must have killed themselves, and I'll wonder how they voted, or will vote. I never can decide. Another neighbor, a guy who fosters greyhounds and talks a lot about fostering greyhounds, told me once, around here, people have a lot of feelings, as if that were a normal thing to say to me alone, spray painting furniture on a Thursday morning, showing no emotion to speak of. But he nodded to the house a few doors down, its front yard spiked with signs, "Don't tread on me," and so forth, and I got it. He wanted to confirm what side he's on, or that we share a side. So many feelings, he said again. And yes, I hated him for wearing one of those hydration backpacks, proving I know the phrase hydration backpack. But it wasn't hate exactly. So I laughed and said, "Sure seems that way," and kept on spraying my table with its second coat of gold. And he headed down our street, walking a greyhound who seemed embarrassed to be walked at all.
Nice. Nice.
Should I read two more? Is that good?
Yeah, two more. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. I'll do, okay. So, I'll do one more hope poem and then I'll do the title poem from the book. So this is another hope poem. It's called Elvis Week. And Elvis Week, I guess I should explain if you're not, if you don't know, the week of Elvis's, the anniversary of Elvis's, I never remember actually if it's his birthday or his death. I think it's the anniversary of his death. But it in any case, it happens in August. It's like the middle of August, and in Memphis, it brings kind of a crazy amount of people are still huge Elvis fans and such big Elvis fans that they come to Memphis for Elvis Week. And there's events all over the city, but especially around Graceland. They have a vigil and they have all of these tours. And if you go on Beale Street, kind of in the downtown area of Memphis, you see all of these Elvis impersonators, and it's a little bit surreal. So that's what the title refers to, is Elvis Week, and it's in August. It's always just god awful hot. Elvis Week. We visit Graceland for the vigil. Hope in the same fuchsia tube dress she wore to our grandpa's funeral. But it's okay this time around. Nobody hissing about what's appropriate. Not in Memphis in August, 99 at dusk, the dew point making people's hair deranged. We clutch our little candles from their cardboard cuffs, and mine keeps blowing out, Hope leaning over to help relight it. There are as many Elvises as Elvis fans, old and not so old, and from the farthest reaches, rolling strollers, luggage, oxygen tanks, so many stick-on sideburns, so many ways to sweat. I don't know it yet, but hope's blurred out on pills again. We both buy buttons with the lightning logo, taking care of business in a flash. One too tall Elvis strums a ukulele, strolling up and down the line along the gates and nodding solemnly. The crowd just slightly hushed. Hope says, "Can you imagine being loved this much?" All right, I'll read one more. This poem is, this is the title poem for the book. And it's called The Survival Expo. And it describes an experience that I've actually thought about a lot during the pandemic. So I went with a friend to this convention center in Memphis. This was probably 2 years ago now, where they were having a survival fair where people who are kind of extreme doomsday preppers can buy and sell products related to survival prepping. And so there was a lot of big amounts of food, and you could walk around inside and tour various kinds of bunkers. And there were, so that was a big part of it, but there were also tons of guns and knives. And I went with this friend who actually was researching for an article she was writing. And we both, I think she was, I don't know, it was simultaneously fascinating and really unsettling. The amount of guns and how quickly you could buy a gun, all of that was really unsettling. But then it's also, there's this whole culture around survival stuff. So anyway, so this poem kind of came out of that. And also the fact that the friend that I had gone to this expo with was just getting over treatment for cancer. So that's kind of comes into the poem too. But okay, yeah, so the Survival Expo. It's mostly men inside the Agri Center, pricing seed vaults and metal shelters, knives and MREs spread over dressed up tables like alms for fraught apostles. Take, eat. And we expected this, my friend and I, but came in anyway, for fun, I guess, except to me, it feels a little like a test to prove how out of place we aren't, which I'll acknowledge is a flaw of mine. This tendency to double down, pretending things are fine, a tactical response. Like when my friend tells me she's feeling better, and all I do is compliment her hair, how thick it's growing in, how glad I am. Before I train my focus on the rep selling disaster rations meant for pets. Taste tested, he explains, on cats, since dogs will eat whatever, but cats are picky bastards. And see, his pack will hold a month's supply. And here's a pocket for your gas mask, and here's a pamphlet about chemtrails, too. But it's the truth, we're sorely unprepared for even minor hazards, acts of God and whatnot. Living as we do along a semi-dormant fault in Tennessee, our billboards lit with shot theology and ads that boast, yes, silencers are legal. So I can understand why there's a line for 20-minute background checks. This being a thoroughly American response to background checks and fear, compared to, say, the Middle Ages, how King Charles VI, believing he was made of glass, sewed iron bars into his clothes and hardly moved and wouldn't let himself be touched, so scared of shattering, which just goes to show the kingdom of the self will always be the hardest to defend. I wonder what he'd think to see us probing superior illumination, lamps that burn for 40 days and charge your phone, which my friend could really use, she tells me, texting a picture to her husband who responds, I think you need to leave the Agri Center. But then we get distracted by these cards with punch-out tools that fit inside your wallet. So if you're stranded in the wilderness or captured and have access to your wallet, you might save yourself. What can it hurt, we say, and stand there for a while comparing options. Snare locks, fish hooks, saw blade, handcuff shim. Because you never know what you'll walk into. And the Agri Center smells like kettle corn. And my friend is feeling better, done with chemo. And I don't know what to say, but can't shut up. Just keep reloading wrong words through the last packed aisles and turnstiles back to Saturday. Appalled, of course, but not ungratified by all these ways we have to stay alive.
Very good. Yeah, I'm not going to come down to Tennessee to come to the survival camp.
It didn't, sorry. Lila. This is the beauties of Zoom.
Yeah, I think Lila wants one of those dogs from the hair or something.
Hold on just a second, sorry. Sorry. Sorry about that. Yes, that didn't make you want to come to the Survival Expo?
Yeah. Now I've been to some weird expos in my life or retail exhibitions, and you go through there and you're like, I don't know, would someone really buy this stuff? But no, it was an interesting poem.
Yeah, I've been to several things at that Agri Center, and it really makes you realize all of the different kinds of subcultures that exist.
So let me just ask you this to kind of kick off the Q&A
Sure.
part. It sounds like, either the neighbors are going to that survival expo. It sounds like there are triggering events. There are some triggering events that may lead you to write, or maybe there are just some observations like of neighbors. Is there a favorite way for like an inspiration to come to you to start writing?
I always, I have this weird relationship with inspiration, or with the word inspiration, because I never really feel inspired, or I never think of what I think of as inspiration is not the way it ever plays out for me. So I will, what I find is that, like, the way that I think of inspiration is that that something very important is moving you and you're writing about it. And for me, often the things that stick don't feel important at all. And I'll wonder why I'm writing about them. And then in the process of writing about them, I kind of figure out why it was that it stuck with me, or why it was important. And so it ends up being the thing, my neighbor's burrito truck was a source of inspiration, I guess, right? But it wasn't, I wouldn't have ever predicted that. But I kept thinking about their burrito truck, and then I ended up sort of writing this poem. And it was a little bit the same way with the Survival Expo. Like, I didn't realize that it had affected me in the ways that it had. And I actually wrote several versions of that poem. It took me a little while to figure out what it was that I was getting at there, and what it was about that experience, the kind of coming together of the thread of being at this place with my friend who was getting over chemo, and then also being around these people that were very much concerned in crazy ways, but in ways that you could kind of understand, with how to protect themselves. And so, but it was, I didn't set out, I didn't go there because I wanted to write a poem about it. And I didn't even afterwards think, oh, I'm going to write a poem about this, but I just kept thinking about it, and then kind of started to work it out. In the poem itself. One of my students, one of my wonderful former students is in the Zoom right now, and she just chatted, wrote into the chat, the thing and the other thing, and that's something that I say in class. It's actually really right that that any poem has the thing you're talking about, and then the other thing that's happening in the background. Or the subtext, or the underlying metaphor. And so it's often, for me, the thing is what gets me going, and only as I start to write about it do I figure out the other thing, like, what am I really talking about here?
And then one last question that I want other people to chime in. When do you decide or know that a poem is finished, that you finished that process and you've closed it out?
I mean, that's one of the, one of the great questions. I think it has to do with the ending for me. A lot of times, if I feel like the ending is hitting the right note, that will help me know. But I mean, and there's also the sense that there's no perfect poem, so that there are some poems that I'm like, okay, I'm okay with this poem, right? I feel like this is mostly finished, but I'm always still tweaking things. And even, that's part of, I was talking at the beginning about editing, doing the final edits for this book. And it's like, I'm still changing things. I'm still kind of, even if it's just like 1 or 2 words. But, I work in poetic forms a fair amount. It wasn't, the poems that I read today, weren't using as many formal constraints as I sometimes use, but that's one way that I kind of, it helps me frame what I'm doing. And so if I can make the form work, then I know that, I have some sense of completion that comes with making the form work. But there's always this sense of things not being completely finished. And I'll look back at a poem that I thought was finished, and I'll still kind of want to make changes to it sometimes. But it's getting things to the place where they mostly feel finished.
So are there other people that have questions for Kaki?
If you have a question, you can unmute yourself, and please feel free to turn on your cameras if you'd like to.
So I tried to turn my camera on and it doesn't let me, Wendy, but it's fine either way.
I can see your little avatar in the middle, your little pictures.
Now it says it's okay. Okay. So I really, really like the survivor. I think that survivor juxtaposition between that and your friend's survivor and all the ways and things. I have a very good friend now who's just recuperating from cancer, my best friend from college. And all those stupid things you say about people's hair, and what's happening with them. And how interesting that you went with her to that survivalist expedition, right? Or whatever it is,
Yeah.
Fair. And that was just really good. And the neighbors once actually has, planted a seed in me. I was thinking, I have 2 neighbors that do psychotherapy online all day long, and I walked past their house today and I'm like, God, their head must be exploding by now, and what a service they're providing. But what do they do? How do they breathe after that much kind of, I Zoom with people a few times a day and it's like, okay, enough. I was like,
right.
Both of those really, I might actually try to play around with that. I do a little bit of poetry writing, but I love the idea. I would love to hear a little bit more about what you were saying about what some of the constraints are that you're talking about, like when you teach a class. I love prompts for writing, and I do prompts. I do collage, and prompts for collage just bring out this whole subconscious stuff that you're like, really? Okay, good to know.
Well, I'm tempted to make my former students answer this. What are the constraints? But I give a lot of constraints when I'm teaching, and I give a lot of constraints for myself, because I think for me that is where the interesting and fun part of writing comes from. And so I do. The poems I was reading today, like I said, I often am playing with meter in looser ways than I used to be. But several of the poems I was writing today were just written in blank verse. So just kind of having a metrical pattern that you're having to follow. But the book, this book that's about to come out has some found poems where, like, there's a poem that consists entirely of the names of towns in Tennessee. And there's a poem that it consists of headlines, like all headlines that follow the iteration of like Mississippi woman finds like pearl in her salad, or Tennessee woman finds blank in the backyard. So like those kinds of like found constraints. I write sonnets and things like that. For my students, I do some of that, but I will give them like list of words they have to put in their poems. So I think that like having often those are their best poems, the ones where I give them all of the stuff they have to put in the poem, because you have this thing that you're working around and you're kind of working against. And you still find your way to whatever the other thing is. But you sometimes have, you need this thing that you're resisting or that you're pushing against. So
Is a haiku a form of restraint? Would you consider like how you write a haiku the form of?
For sure, yeah. I mean, any length restraints, or length constraints, meter, different formal things. Just kind of trying to figure out what you can do that is outside of just the normal way that you write or think.
My personal favorite, I had to write a sestina and use the word daiquiri.
That's
that
right.
was very difficult.
But it was great. And the daiquiri became this like image in the sestina. Yeah. It's so good to see you, Karina. I miss you terribly.
I miss you.
Linda, you have a question. It looks like your hand is raised.
Yeah, my virtual hand. Not so much a question, but a comment and a compliment. So ever since the pandemic began, I've been picking a poem every night and putting it up in the morning and sending it out to an email list of a couple of dozen friends and family. And so when I saw your name as being in this event, I looked you up and found a couple of your poems online. And the one I sent out, and I really, really liked it, was Lares and Penates.
Oh, nice. Oh.
And I have to say, I didn't recognize those words. I didn't know the words. So I read the poem. I think I got it. And then I looked up the words and I saw that they are, for people that maybe the one or two people that don't know, the names of minor Roman deities in Roman mythology whose job was to guard the household. And so reading the poem again, I saw the irony of the title and your text. And so I had to decide in putting this out to my well-educated friends, but I couldn't assume they knew these two words. Should I spill the beans? And I did. This is the ironic title of this very wonderful poem. So I just want you to know that you have a fan, and I look forward to reading more of your work. So thank you for doing this.
Thank you.
Now you probably have to read that poem at some point because I'm curious.
Yeah, I wonder if I could remember. That poem is from my first book, and it's old. I mean, it's way back there in my brain, but it's also a poem from some of the poems in my first book. I feel I'm just at a different place now, and I feel mildly embarrassed about. But that's one that I still like, so it makes me happy that you found it and liked it.
Yeah, can I pop in with a question? It's
ahead.
actually for you and John. It's not about your poem, but earlier on you mentioned a piece in the New York Times, and I just wondered who was the author of that. Was it Nora McInerney, or which piece was it on time?
I can find that.
It's I don't know how to. I don't know. I'm terrible at pronouncing. It's Perul.
Okay,
Right.
so on the op-ed pages.
Yeah, and she's kind of their main book reviewer. But it's really it was like in yesterday's. I don't know. I always read it online, so I don't know where it falls into the actual paper. But it was in the book section. But she was talking about time, the way that we are experiencing time right now. I think it was really great. I thought.
Thank you.
So,
I have a question.
Yeah, Kaki, I like that the idea of the other thing, and I think I saw Marie Howe, who was the poet of New York State. I saw her at Kripalu in 2017. And I think it was her that said it, that you write a poem because it needs to tell you something. I don't know if that was her. I'm remembering that was her, and I was kind of like, it was like, I don't know, maybe I should write a bunch of poems because I have to hear stuff. I just thought it was such an interesting concept of you're writing about the thing, but maybe that other thing becomes the part that you need to engage and embrace.
Yeah, I mean, I have to remind myself of that all the time, and teaching actually really helps because I have to remind my students that too. And then I'll be thinking, as I'm giving that advice, like, why am I, like, I will be working on a poem that's driving me crazy, and I'll think, why am I not taking my own advice right now? But I think that just with writing in general, there's the feeling that you should know what you're doing. And oftentimes there's a feeling that you should know what you're doing at the very beginning. And that's just never the way it's been for me. Like, I've never really understood, maybe like a handful of times have I ever really understood why I was writing a poem when I started. Or I would think I was doing one thing, and then by the time I finished the poem, I realized, oh, what I was really doing was getting at some other thing that I didn't even totally understand at the time. But it's really hard to remember that like there is this process of discovery that's supposed to happen, or I think that in good poems happens, and it's a discovery that should happen for the writer and the reader. But that can be hard. I think we tend to think we have to have an idea, a fully fleshed out idea that we're writing about before we start writing. And I'm just not that kind of writer, I don't think.
Yeah, no. I think it's interesting how everyone approaches the process. Someone said to us, I don't know, maybe it was James, they write daily notes, and then those notes kind of get, I call it getting cooked on the stove and
Yeah,
boil or become something. And, other people just, there's some random observation, and that, so I'm always interested in I think for me, it's maybe things I'm a little bit upset about. I've written a couple of poems, and when it kind of gets my dander up, that's when I get my pen out or start hitting the keyboard.
Yeah.
Maybe that's what works for me. So.
Yeah, I never get tired of hearing about people's writing processes. Like, I think it's so interesting the way people process, the way they process their experience, but also the way they kind of put together a piece of writing is I think really interesting. Yes.
And
I think that idea of having, let me see how you said it, like that you're never quite sure what it is until it is, or like that creative process that you discover what it is as you're doing it, for me, seems pretty consistent with art in general when people are doing things, right? That, that a lot of times you step back from whatever you're working on, whether it's a writing piece or poetry or collage or painting, and you go, oh, that's where I need to go. Or you put it away and you come back and you go, oh, I didn't see that before.
Right. Mm-hmm. That you're really not necessarily the best judge of what's happening. The other people sometimes can see it, or you can see it with a little bit of distance.
Kaki, I have a question for you, just about your you as a poet and your relationship. When did you discover poetry? Was there a particular poem or a teacher, or how did you find poetry, or how did poetry find you?
I mean, this is it. I think this probably would be true for, well, I don't know, maybe a lot of people. But I loved. I came from a family of people that don't really read. Although my mother is a teacher, and so she would read to us, right? And she would give us like lots of stuff to read. But I loved Shel Silverstein. That was my first, and like Dr. Seuss and stuff like that. And so I would read anything by them that I could find. And after, so I started to kind of get into poetry when I was like 9 or 10, and then I moved away from it for a little while, and I came back to it like early high school. But I was an athlete, and my family was sort of like, what is our daughter? She likes poetry. What is this? But then I kind of, I had teachers and people that around me that would sort of give me things. And then I was running with it on my own. But the earliest stuff was just like kids' poems, and I still think about that, like the rhymes and rhythms of kids' poetry. I think it's so wonderful. And the weirdness, right, of someone like Shel Silverstein I thought was just so great. The darkness and the weirdness really, really appealed to me as a, like a 10-year-old kid.
Thanks.
Joanne, I know you've had your hand up for a while. Do you have a question? And James also has a hand up, so.
Here's some poets that you like to read now, or other writers you like.
So poets that I like to read right now. Well, I'm James Davis, who's in our group, and Sarah Trudgeon. I would say that even if they weren't in the room. I just finished reading James Davis's book because I was blurbing it, and it's awesome. It's so good. And Sarah Trudgeon has 2 amazing chapbooks. But other than the 2 of them, I love Terrence Hayes. I think he's incredible. He does everything he does. It blows me away. I've been reading a lot of Mary Ruefle lately. I'm fascinated by her, the kind of light touch that her poems have. They seem sort of breezy, but they're really complicated and funny and just strange. I've been reading a lot of Mary Ruefle lately. I love the Canadian poet Karen Soley, who Sarah Trudgeon kind of turned me on to. I'm trying to think who. I just finished reading Morgan Parker's book Magical Negro, which I thought was really wonderful. I liked her previous book, There Are More Beautiful Things Than Beyonce, but I think this one's better. I liked it better. Yeah, that's my most kind of my recent list of books.
Thank you.
Yeah, those are all very, very contemporary, recent collections. But. Yeah. Yes.
Hey, Kaki.
Hi.
Hey. So my mother's name is Hope, and I find naming her in a poem can be a very fraught experience. So I was just wondering if you could talk about some best practices of writing a character named Hope, and any thoughts you have on character naming in general. I would be interested in hearing.
Well, this is the first time I've used this particular tactic. I tend to write about people in my life and not name them, because I do feel, I don't know, like I feel a little bit of responsibility, even to the people I don't like in my life, of not like totally selling them out. Or I'm careful about I've tended, my previous book was, it was like a fictional character named Winona, and a lot of the stuff was very close to my life, but I was like, I'd fictionalized it all. And so, this is fictionalized too, but it was kind of an interesting choice to kind of create a name for this character. And I'm trying to remember the whole thought process behind naming this person Hope, but I think I did like the idea that one way, kind of heavy-handed way to read these poems is like a personification of hope. And there is this one poem, I didn't read it, but it's called Hope is the Thing with Feathers, which is the first line of that Emily Dickinson poem. But in this poem, it's Hope, and she's at the bowling alley, and she's wearing like a feather boa. So, so it was fun for me to imagine at different points when I was working on this series that, like, what if this really is the personification of hope personified, and she's like, getting $200 to be punched in the face by a woman in a bar and all of these kinds of things, But that was, I was a little bit concerned about, I didn't want it to be, there's this great book by the poet Sasha West called Failure and I Bury the Body. Do you know this book? And she does really cool things with personifying failure, like failure, capital F is its character. And I really love that book, but I didn't want it to be like that. I didn't want Hope to be as personified as failure is in that book. But so I wanted it to be a character name.
Well, Hope is a real name.
Right, exactly.
Failure.
No one has never named their failure. That's right. But so that was why I felt like it was a name that kind of did double duty, right? But I haven't, I guess I named characters in the Winona book, but I haven't, there's a couple of poems in this forthcoming book that are pretty much straight up autobiographical. and they don't use names, but they'll, they refer to there's one poem about my mother, or about my mother's family. And I still haven't let anyone in my family read them. And I'm a little bit worried that they're going to be angry, but they're not, they're not salacious at all, really. But I've always been really careful about that, and kind of how I can sort of change things just a little bit so that it doesn't leave anybody feeling uncomfortable. But the other thing is that, I find that my family doesn't actually read things very closely, is what I've learned. And so I used to be more worried about that than I am now, but I think that they're not paying as much attention as we sometimes think.
James, do you know the podcast Between the Covers?
Yes.
No.
Or it's a book podcast, a long interview podcast. But
Yeah.
in a recent episode, he interviewed the poet Rachel Zucker, who has an amazing poetry podcast, if any of you are interested, called Commonplace. And she has these long interviews with just like all of these amazing poets, Sharon Olt, just everybody. But in his interview with her, there's a really long discussion about this, like the ethics of naming people and putting real people in your poems. That might be interesting. And she also, I think, found some answers in Foucault, which she found very amusing. She just really never thought she would be reading Foucault. Anyway, that's a good one.
I'm going to write that down. I would like to hear what she has to say about that.
And Kaki,
Yeah, that's something Sarah and I.
Kaki, that no movie stars named their kid Failure. Really? Nobody's done that yet? I thought that was pretty funny.
Sure that Puritans.
Are we sure that nobody's named Failure?
what was
Failure.
Frank Zappa's kids were like Moonbeam or Moonshine or something?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
So Kaki, what's a coincidence is our Shiba Inu is named Kibo, and Kibo means hope in Japanese.
Oh, nice.
So,
I love Shiba Inus. They're so cute.
yeah, I think we'll have to start, doing some poetry things around thematics.
Yeah.
So we'll have a failure poetry hour. We'll have a hope poetry hour. No, all really fun stuff. Look at James. James is like getting revved up now. I can tell. Anyone else? Comments, questions? We're coming to the end of our hour. Hey, Sarah, send me that specifics about the podcast so we can, post it in next week's notice, because that I think would be a great thing for people to know about. And for the people on this this poetry hour, we had Edward Hirsch last week being interviewed by our board vice president, and that was kind of this interesting travelogue, about poets, about styles, about seriousness, about it was just like this compelling hour of this poetry journey, and the library also put that on. So we've had some great poetry things over the last month or so. Great.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you for coming. I'm seeing Amanda. It's nice to see. Amanda's probably holding a baby right now. But yeah, but yeah, Karina, I want to jump through the screen and hug you. It's been so long since I've seen some of you, but thank you, people that I know, and also people that I have only met. It's nice to see all of you.
No, and thank you for taking the time. I think these poetry hours have really become a great time for me every week, just to connect with different people and hear different things and how processes work for people. So, Kaki, thank you again for your presentation. It's been great.
Thank you.
Yes, I second that. Kaki, thank you so much for joining us. Your poetry is amazing. You're going to send me back to the virtual bookstore to be.
Good.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was great.
Very good. We're signing off until next week.
Okay.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.